The sky over Tel Aviv had barely darkened when the first sirens wailed. What began as a standard alert quickly unraveled into chaos. Iran, long accused of empty threats, unleashed a barrage of precision-guided missiles that overwhelmed Israel's Iron Dome. For years, Israel had boasted about its superior defense systems, unmatched intelligence, and a deterrence doctrine carved in stone. But that night, the illusion shattered. Streets once lit with confidence were now blanketed in smoke and disbelief. It was a calculated assault, precise, unrelenting, and strategic. Air bases, radar stations, and weapons depots bore the brunt, as did the nation's pride. Civilians flooded shelters, while military command scrambled to regain control. Phones buzzed with half-truths and panic as the sound of explosions replaced routine. The unthinkable had happened. Iran struck not in proxy, but with full intent, and Israel's aura of invincibility suffered a deep fracture. In the halls of power, disbelief reigned. Israeli intelligence had known the risks, the rhetoric, and the regional dynamics. But this was different. Iran hadn't just poked, it had pierced. For years, proxy wars in Syria, Lebanon, and Gaza served as battlegrounds for indirect confrontations. But on this night, the mask came off. Supreme Leader Khamenei had ordered the strike not through Hezbollah, not via militias, but directly from Iranian soil. It was a move of defiance, one born from years of sanctions, assassinations, and humiliation. Israel's famed Mossad was caught off guard, a failure as stunning as the attack itself. The Prime Minister convened the war cabinet in a bunker, barking orders through gritted teeth. Questions flew. How? Why now? Where was the US? But no answers came, only more reports of damage and loss. The nation's psyche, built on preemptive strength, had been wounded not just militarily but emotionally. At the United Nations, silence was the loudest sound. The emergency session convened late, filled with stale condemnations and diplomatic hesitations. Iran called the strike a defensive retaliation, citing years of Israeli aggression in Damascus and covert operations in Tehran. Russia smirked from its seat, China spoke in riddles, and Western allies offered vague statements about a restraint. No resolution passed, no coalition formed. Israel, used to backing from Washington and London, stood isolated in its darkest hour. Protesters outside the UN waved Palestinian flags and chanted slogans about resistance. For Israel, this was more than an assault, it was abandonment. Where was the unbreakable bond now? Tel Aviv watched the world respond not with fury but with fatigue. Global powers, weary of Middle East entanglements, issued platitudes instead of promises. It wasn't just a military failure, it was a diplomatic reckoning. Inaction echoed louder than sirens ever could. Back home, Iran celebrated. Streets of Tehran filled with flag-waving youth and aging revolutionaries. State media ran non-stop footage of missile launches and satellite images of impact. A new era, they declared, has begun. Ayatollah Khamenei addressed the nation, not in warning but in triumph. We've shown them their limits, he said. To his people, this wasn't just about Israel. It was about dignity, defiance, and long-buried pain. From the assassination of Qasem Soleimani to cyber attacks crippling nuclear plants, Iran had been battered for decades. Now it claimed to have answered in kind. The Revolutionary Guard, often mocked for bluster, now stood as heroes to many. Across Shia communities in Iraq, Lebanon and Yemen, fireworks erupted. The Arab street, long skeptical of Iranian motives, paused. Could this be a shift in the region's balance? Iran, once a pariah, had taken center stage, bold, defiant, and unapologetic. Inside Israel, anger grew like wildfire. Social media exploded with blame. Some pointed at the government, others at military leaders. How could this have happened? Where were the promises of security? For a society used to victory and vengeance, the night felt surreal. Young soldiers posted photos from the front lines, asking for reinforcements and equipment. Hospitals overflowed with casualties, while rescue crews dug through rubble. The cabinet, rattled and divided, debated response strategies, but the damage was already done. Military pride had been humbled, and with it, the public's trust. Opposition leaders demanded accountability. Thousands marched through the streets, not against Iran, but against their own leaders. The invincibility myth was broken, and in its place came introspection. Perhaps they had relied too heavily on technology. Perhaps diplomacy had been ignored too long. That night, for the first time in decades, Israel felt vulnerable, and it did not sit well. In Washington, confusion reigned. The president, awakened in the early hours, huddled with his national security team. The attack was undeniable, yet public appetite for war was non-existent. Elections loomed. The American people, weary of entanglements, did not want another desert conflict. Pentagon analysts offered grim scenarios. A full-scale counterattack could ignite the region. Oil markets had already spiked. Gulf allies were on edge. The administration released a tepid statement. "We stand with Israel but urge restraint." Behind closed doors, pressure mounted. Some advisers advocated a strong joint strike. Others warned of Russian and Chinese opportunism. Diplomats reached out to Tehran quietly. Messages were exchanged through back channels in Oman and Qatar, but Iran had no interest in talking, at least not yet. It had made its point. The silence from the White House wasn't just strategy, it was paralysis. And for Israel it felt like betrayal. Europe too watched with conflicted eyes. In Paris, Berlin and Brussels, leaders urged calm, yet their streets told a different story. Protests erupted, many cheering the attack as a symbol of resistance against Western-backed dominance. Others, horrified by violence on either side, called for de-escalation. News outlets debated legitimacy, history and blame, but few outright condemned Iran. Old colonial memories, the Gaza wars and recent Israeli policies had soured public sympathy. Diplomatic channels remained open, but political will had evaporated. European powers, once eager to mediate, now seemed resigned to a new reality. Israel was no longer untouchable. The idea of its moral superiority, long touted in Western capitals, had eroded under years of occupation and regional aggression. And now, faced with an open wound, Europe offered only gauze, not protection. It was a moment of cold clarity. When the moment came, the world blinked, and then turned away. So with military analysts scrambled to understand what had happened. Iran's missile systems had evolved dramatically, no longer crude, inaccurate tools of terror, but high-speed, stealth-enabled, satellite-guided weapons. Intelligence failures were now glaring. Had Israel underestimated Iran's capabilities? Had it misjudged its resolve? For years, Western think tanks dismissed Iran as a regional nuisance, annoying but not dangerous. That assessment now seemed outdated. The attack wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. It shattered assumptions. It forced generals to rethink strategies, alliances and doctrine. Pentagon reports quietly circulated, suggesting the need for an urgent overhaul in Middle East policy. Drones, cyber tools and AI systems had all been used, but not by the West. Iran had flipped the narrative. In a war fought as much in perception as in firepower, Tehran had won round one. And everyone, especially Israel, knew it. In Beirut, Baghdad and Damascus, reactions were mixed. Some saw it as justice, others as provocation. Hezbollah praised the strike but stayed its hand, for now. Iraq's fractured parliament debated their country's place in the conflict. Syria, scarred and weary, watched from the sidelines. But among the people, a question stirred. Could Iran's boldness ignite something new? Could the axis of resistance become more than a slogan? For years, regional politics had been shaped by powerlessness and fragmentation. This strike, however brutal, had demonstrated capability. Whether admired or feared, it demanded attention. The Gulf monarchies, traditionally suspicious of Iran, suddenly faced uncomfortable truth. Their own defences were limited. Their alliances with the West now seemed shaky. Conversations once whispered in diplomatic salons now roared on television panels. The Middle East, long stuck in cycles of proxy wars, had entered a new chapter, one where lines blurred and fears deepened. Amid the wreckage, ordinary people paid the highest price. Israeli families mourned lost children. Iranian families braced for retaliation. In both nations, humanity was buried under nationalism. Peace, once a distant dream, now felt unreachable. In schools, children drew missiles instead of birds. In mosques and synagogues, prayers were spoken with clenched hearts. The media played its role, stoking fires of anger, demanding vengeance. But in quiet corners, some questioned the madness. Why must history repeat itself in blood? Artists, poets and thinkers began to speak, not in support of either side, but in lament of the silence of the world, the silence of peace. For amid the roaring jets and booming explosions, the loudest noise was the lack of compassion. The kind that could have stopped this before it started, but it didn't. And now, both nations bore the cost of a pride war. No one truly won. As weeks passed, tensions remained high. Retaliation was promised, then postponed. Talks were floated, then abandoned. The region held its breath. Would Israel strike back? Would the US intervene? Would Iran push further? But the answers never came, not clearly. Instead, a new normal began to settle. One where the old power dynamics no longer held, where fear, not diplomacy, shaped futures. Military bases across the Middle East went on high alert. Air traffic routes changed. Embassies reduced staff. It was a tense calm, a pregnant pause, and while leaders spoke of stability, everyone knew. The next spark could come from anywhere. The attack had redefined the conflict, not ended it. And though the missiles had stopped falling, the psychological warfare had just begun. The world had watched in silence once. Would it remain silent again? Or had something deep and irreversible already shifted? In the end, it wasn't about just one night. It was about decades of mistrust, decades of missed chances, and decades of arrogance on all sides. Israel's pride, Iran's rage, the world's apathy, all collided in a single moment of devastation. And from that moment, a new narrative was born, one where strength was no longer defined by who struck first, but who could endure the consequences. Israel would rebuild, Iran would brace, the world would watch, debate, and move on. But something fundamental had changed. No longer was deterrence a guarantee, no longer were red lines respected, and no longer was silence neutral. Because when the bombs fell and the world stayed silent, it wasn't just a nation's pride that broke, it was the illusion that might alone could ensure peace. And in that brokenness, perhaps, a new question emerged, not who will win, but what remains, after all, has been lost.